Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm Margaret Talgott, Director of Literary Programs and the creator and producer of this author series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, Irish American history. On your screen is the schedule for our 75-minute event centered on the book Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York by Tyler Anbinder. On your screen, you'll see a schedule for our 75-minute event. Please know that for the next 30 minutes, Professor Anbinder will be sharing images and some really fascinating data. After that, he'll be joined by moderator genealogist Melanie McComb from my organization, American Ancestors. She'll be posing some of her own questions and then many of yours sent in events. Thank you so much for sending those. We also welcome your questions tonight, live. So if you have new or additional queries, please enter them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on the right, and our speakers will address as many as they can. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in the Brew Family Learning Center of American Ancestors. Their video will be published on our website in the day ahead. All registered attendees will be emailed the link, which is also being placed in the Zoom chat. Tonight's discussion should be highly informative, but of course, the real deep education comes from reading Professor Anbinder's work. For those of you who purchased tickets that included his book, a signed book-plated copy of Plentiful Country will be mailed in the weeks ahead directly from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. For those who didn't order a signed book, but deciding now that they want one, please never fear. When all is said and done, there should be 8 to 10 signed copies of Plentiful Country in stock at Porter Square Books, and you can order those directly from them tonight or tomorrow morning. The dedicated bookstore URL is now being shared in the chat and will be emailed to you in the hours ahead. The same goes for bundled book buyers who might want additional copies for yourself or as a gift. You can order signed books through the bookstore and have them sent anywhere in the United States. Now, for some background on our special guest this evening. Tyler Anbinder is an historian, emeritus professor of history at George Washington University. There, he taught courses on the history of American immigration and the American Civil War era. He is the author of 3 award-winning books and numerous articles, and his publications have been honored with the Avery Craven Prize of the Organization of American Historians, the Mark Linton History Prize of the Columbia School of Journalism, and the Hubble Prize of the Society of Civil War Historians. Professor Anbinder has held also the Fulbright Commission's Thomas Jefferson Distinguished Chair in American History at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. He's also won 3 prestigious research grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, turning to our moderator, Melanie McComb. As senior genealogist at American Ancestors, NAHGS, she assists members and visitors with family history research. She has particular expertise in Irish and Jewish genealogical research, tracing families back to their ancestral homelands. She's also experienced in DNA and Atlantic Canada and lectures internationally on various topics. Melanie is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist, a detail that I especially wanted to share tonight. Melanie will join us shortly, as I said, in a half an hour. But for now, a big welcome to Professor Anbinder. I'm so sorry, Professor Anbinder, that we're not in the same room tonight. When we open our new Center for Family History, Heritage, and Culture this fall in Boston on Newbury Street, we're going to fix such things, and we're going to do more hybrid programming. If folks such as you in Virginia will please make your way north, we would love to host you in person another time. As you know, I really enjoyed Plentiful Country, especially as my husband's ancestors lived for a time in the Five Points area of Manhattan. And my Scottish relatives lived in Brooklyn, just across the bridge in Brooklyn Heights. I learned so much from reading your work, and I can't wait to hear more, as do so many in the audience. We look forward to hearing from you. So over to you, and then eventually to Melanie. Thank you so much for being here, Professor.
Sure. Oh, I'm happy to be here. I wish I was in the Boston area too. I was born in Cambridge, and have enjoyed visiting there. My son and my grandson was born there in Cambridge also, so I've enjoyed being in Boston a lot in the last couple of years. If we can get up my first slide, please, we can begin our talk. And let's go to the next one after that. So I want to start here where the first chapter of my book starts, in the on the Lansdowne estate in County Kerry. If you look at that little map at the bottom left of your screen, you'll see County Kerry is the bottom left county, and the Lansdowne estate is dark there. It's in southwest County Kerry. This estate was owned by a British aristocrat, the Marquis of Lansdowne, who at the time of the Great Potato Famine was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He lived in London, but he had inherited through several generations this 100 square mile estate in Ireland, one of the biggest there. He rarely visited his estate, but he collected the taxes, thousands and thousands of pounds per year in rents that poor Irish peasants paid for the land on which they grew their potatoes. This is a reconstruction of a potato famine era cabin there. And so thousands of Lansdowne's tenants ended up coming to New York during the famine to escape starvation. Go to the next slide. Two of those immigrants were John Lane and Dennis Sullivan. So imagine the shock they must have felt going from that green, verdant scene to this scene in the Five Points neighborhood of New York. John Lane first lived in this tenement at 31 Baxter Street, this 5-story building that towered over the Five Points neighborhood. Dennis Sullivan lived catty corner across the street at 6 Little Water Street, in this wooden tenement here that you can see on the right. And they lived with hundreds of other Lansdowne immigrants. They start out with very similar situations. Like so many of the famine immigrants, they begin their lives in America as menial day laborers. Day laborers in those days primarily did construction work in a place like New York. Mostly that involved digging out cellars and building the foundations, and then hauling away the dirt and the rocks and hauling into the construction site and up to the artisans, the bricks, the mortar, the timber, everything that was used to build New York's buildings. They both start out doing day labor, but after about 5 years in New York, their stories diverge. John Lane saved up enough money to open a tenement in the actually ground floor right there of 31 Baxter Street. He eventually moved it up the block to a different location. And he ran a saloon there throughout the late 1850s. And in the mid 1860s, he saved up enough money from his profits as a saloon keeper to move uptown and buy a tenement of his own, in which he opened a saloon on the ground floor and then rented out the apartments above to make even more money. Dennis Sullivan, on the other hand, stayed in Five Points and remained a day laborer for the next 30 years until his death in the 1880s. And so if you've read accounts of the famine immigrants, and can we have the next slide, please? If you've read accounts of the famine immigrants, you might wonder whose story was more common, that of John Lane, the day laborer turned saloon keeper and landlord, or that of Dennis Sullivan, the person who remained a day laborer his entire life in New York. If you read the accounts of the famine immigrants in American history books, you would expect that Dennis Sullivan's story was more common. These books tell a story of the famine immigrants as locked in dead-end jobs because they had come to America without decent educations, without capital. They were discriminated against, And for all these reasons, they were not able to move up America's socioeconomic ladder, say the historical accounts. On the other hand, in the era itself, people commented on how surprisingly often it was that the famine immigrants did move up the famine ladder. Here's one poster that was an ad for a book, but the poster illustrates this fact. Here's the peasant leaving Ireland, shoeless, in rags, and here he is a generation later in fine clothes, in a fine home, employing a servant of his own. And so I wondered, why was it that the account of historians differed so much than the account of people back in the famine era? Can we have the next slide, please? So one reason that I think historians that their view of what happened to the famine immigrants diverged so much from that of contemporary accounts was because the famine immigrants are particularly difficult to track, to find out to what extent John Lane's story was common, to find out to what extent Dennis Sullivan's story was common. But about 20 years ago, a new resource that helps answer this question became available. These were the records of the Emigrant Savings Bank. The Emigrant Savings Bank was opened in 1850 in New York City by Irish Americans for the famine immigrants. The bank, when it started, promised that it would invest the deposits of its customers in the most safe, most conservative manner, so that depositors would never have to worry, in an era before deposit insurance like we have today, would never have to worry that their money might be lost should a bank become insolvent. Now, what the bank did worry about was that people's money would be lost through theft. And so, in particular, because there were so many hundreds of thousands of famine immigrants arriving in New York, and so many of them had the same names, the bank took special measures to make sure that nobody could impersonate a depositor and try to get out somebody else's money. And so what the bank did in these ledger books that they called test books, they recorded, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, a slew of information about each depositor. So, for example, this is the account information at the bottom for Peter Lynch. It says down there at the bottom, he is a native of Rahood, 6 miles from Kells, County Westmeath. It's really Meath, but they wrote Westmeath, in Ireland. He's been in the US 5 years next Christmas. He came per the ship SEA from Liverpool. And it has the name of his father, his mother, including her maiden name, and the names of his 1 brother and 4 sisters and their whereabouts. It also has his wife. It lists his wife and her maiden name and their children, in this case, no children. And so the bank used all that information. So if somebody came to the bank and said, "I'm Peter Lynch, give me my money," they would test them. They'd say, "So if you're really Peter Lynch, what's your mother's maiden name?" This is the very first business we know of that used mother's maiden name as a security question. Or they might ask, "What was the name of the ship you came to America on? And tell me the names of your 4 sisters in birth order." And they would use those things to try to ferret out thieves. That information becomes really useful in tracking the famine immigrants. Can we go to the next slide, please? There's just an image of the bank. This is actually from about from the late 1870s. So the clothing would have been different, but the interior of the bank would have been just the same. And so you can see there the clerks behind the counter who would have been asking these questions of the depositors. And can we have the next slide, please? And so there were over 125 Peter Lynches of about the right age, born in Ireland, living in the United States in the era of the Peter Lynch from Rahood. So until the introduction of the Emigrant Savings Bank records, it would be impossible to track Peter Lynch from his arrival in New York in about 1850 to find out what happened to him. But because of the Emigrant Savings Bank records, and you might say, well, because a lot of you I know are genealogists, and you might say, well, you can use his wife's name to track him down, or his children's names. Well, in this case, Peter was married to a Mary, so that's not very useful. There are 26 Peter Lynches married to Marys of about the right age, born in Ireland, living in the United States in this era. And he has no children. We are, however, able to track him because here we find in the 1885 Minnesota census a Peter Lynch living with 5 people who are approximately his age, so probably siblings. And you look at the names, they are Anne, Jane, Mary, James, and Ellen. So the exact same names that were given in the test book and in the right order. So you do a little research, you go to find a grave, and you can find the gravestone for Peter Lynch that in fact says that he is from the townland of Rahoud in County Meath, and thus you can confirm that the Peter Lynch who worked in New York for the first decade of his life as a day laborer at a sugar refinery, moved to Minnesota in 1857, bought farmland, and lived for the next, as you can see here, 30 plus years as a successful farmer. And you can look at the his probate records and see that when he died, he owned his farmland outright, and he had not a single debt to his name. So can we go to the next slide, please? And so I used these records, did searches like this for there were about 10,000 Irish immigrants who had accounts at the Immigrant Savings Bank in the 1850s. Me and a small army of research assistants searched for people like Peter Lynch and his wife Mary and their siblings and tried to find what happened to them. And that's how my book is organized. It's kind of organized as a climb up the socioeconomic ladder, because that was very much the thing that the famine immigrants were focused on, was achieving success. They were a very ambitious bunch of immigrants, like most immigrants are. So in order to understand how high the famine immigrants climbed up the American socioeconomic ladder, we need to know where they started. And the bank records help us establish that too. Not every immigrant opened an account right when they arrived in America, but a lot of them did. And then we can use other records like New York's 1855 census, which lists how long each person has been in New York, and we can use that as a stand-in for immigration year in most cases. And thus we can make a list like I have here of what occupations the famine immigrants did when they first arrived in New York. And this is one of the first surprising things I found in my work, because nobody had done something like this before. Nobody had ever been able to figure out what did the famine Irish do when they first got to New York. The assumption was they'd all become day laborers, the men, and that the women had all become domestics. And of course, the women did mostly become domestics. More than 70% of the women I found in my study of the Irish famine, women worked as domestics. That stereotype is true, but the stereotype of the men turned out not to be so true. As you can see, only about half of the men, the famine immigrants, when they arrive in America, actually start doing unskilled work like day labor, longshoreman, porter, things like that. A third are actually artisans, tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, etc. And about 15% can actually get white collar work, clerical or as business owners, right when they arrive. And so this is something that really hasn't been well known. And what this points out, which is really important, is that the famine immigrants in America were not a cross-section of the Irish population, right? The poorest of the poor couldn't afford to come to America. Not only could they not afford the fare, but they couldn't afford the food you needed to buy, because the journey, as many of you know, took about 5 weeks on average from Liverpool to New York, and you had to bring your own food with you. And famine victims who are starving or near starvation, they don't have the money to buy 5 weeks worth of food. And if somebody sends them money for a ship ticket, they're going to spend all the money to buy food to keep themselves and their families alive. So it's really not the average Irish citizen who is coming to America during the famine. It's kind of middle to lower middle class people who are coming, people who are still doing okay, but want to come to America with their savings before that savings runs out. You can see that also in terms of the extent to which the famine immigrants can read and write. Because the bank also asked its customers to sign their names, and a lot of them couldn't sign their names, so you can get a sense of how many are literate. And the New York Irish were twice as likely to be literate as the as an inhabitant of Ireland. Again, telling you that it's not just a cross-section of the Irish who are coming to America during the famine. So let's see what these famine immigrants do once they get to New York. Now, I've only been given 30 minutes for my talk, and I don't even have very much left. So I'm just going to focus on men in my talk here, but I'll be happy to talk later on in the Q&A, or et cetera, about women. Just ask. So if we can go to the next slide. So of course, the stereotypical work that Irish immigrant men did in New York was day labor. And here on the right, you see Patrick O'Rourke. This is a cartoon that illustrated the rise of the Irish up the socioeconomic ladder. So the first image, which you can't see here, shows first year, he arrives in New York in his rags. Second year, which is this image, he's climbing a ladder at a construction site. This fellow here is carrying mortar. The fellow behind him is carrying bricks, typical day labor work. As we saw, about half the male famine immigrants when they arrived do this kind of work. Overwhelmingly, this kind of work. Construction is by far the biggest kind of work, though you could get a job paving streets. In other parts of the country, of course, there's other kinds of work. You could be building a railroad, digging a canal. But in New York City, construction was overwhelmingly what day laborers did. Can we get the next slide, please? One of the other jobs you could do was be a gas man working in a gas works. So, of course, New York was lit by gaslight in this era. We might imagine that that gaslight came from natural gas piped from some far-flung place. But no, gas in this era was manufactured. The gas that lit the gas lights of New York was manufactured in New York City in plants like this. What they did was they took coal, they burned the coal at a really high temperature. The gases given off from the burning coal were separated, and the part that you could burn was sent into huge tanks, and then from those tanks, it was sent through gas lines to the gas lights of New York. This, as you can imagine, and that this picture shows, was just hideous work, especially in the summertime. But I talk about the gasmen in the book because they highlight the role of networking in getting jobs. So there are hundreds and hundreds of people who were Irish immigrants who work in gas works like this. But what I found was that at the city's biggest gas works, which was at the corner of First Avenue and 21st Street and took up an entire city block from First Avenue to Avenue A, most of the Irish immigrants who worked there were from one tiny little town on the Dingle Peninsula, Castle Gregory, which you can see in the little inset map there on the bottom left. Even though the town only had 500 people, there were as many as 100 of them working at any one time at the New York City gas works. One immigrant from Castle Gregory must have started there. The gas works needed more men because turnover there was very high. He sent word to his family and friends in Ireland, there's plenty of work here at the gas works if you want to come over. And so that became a network where the gas works hired men from Castle Gregory, and Castle Gregory sent immigrant after immigrant to fill its labor force. Can we get the next slide, please? Now, some kinds of unskilled labor paid more than others, and one of those was working as a porter. Porters sometimes were wage workers in businesses. They might carry, in a hardware store, in a grocery, they might carry your goods to the curb and move things around that were too heavy for the grocer himself to move. But the majority of porters were public porters working at places like train stations, ferry terminals, and along the docks where ships came in, offering to carry things like this trunk on their backs from your ship to wherever you needed it to go. Porters, we know from the bank records, saved about 25% more than than day laborers. And this is primarily because porters, the amount of money that they earned was based not like a day laborer was, where you got $1 a day, that was the standard wage. But the earlier they got to work, the later they stayed at work, the more they gabbed with their customers and glad-handed with them to get tips, the more money they earned. And so we know from the bank records that a porter, working as a porter, was in a sense a step up for an unskilled worker because the income was significantly higher. Can we get the next slide, please? So I tracked hundreds and hundreds of unskilled workers for 10 or more years to see what became of them. And what we find is illustrated here, and I'll just talk about it briefly. Of the famine male immigrants who arrive in America and first work as unskilled workers, only about 6 in 10 are still unskilled workers at the end of their American careers. The other 40% have moved up the socioeconomic ladder. That's my little socioeconomic ladder on the right there. And as you can see, the biggest number of them who move up are moving up all the way to business owner. Others become peddlers, which we'll talk about in a second. But so 40% moving up. That's a huge amount of upward socioeconomic mobility, much more than scholars had previously recognized. Next slide, please. So as you may have noticed there, my next step up the socioeconomic ladder for a famine immigrant was work as a peddler. You might look at these images here of peddlers, a person selling used hats on the left, an umbrella dealer on the right, and think, why classify them higher than day laborers? Their lives look miserable, maybe more miserable than a day laborer or a porter. But here's why they were classified higher. Because we know from the bank records that peddlers did economically very well. The peddlers saved not only a lot more money than unskilled workers, they saved more money in their bank accounts than skilled workers like artisans. They saved more money than white-collar workers like clerical workers and civil servants. And they even saved more money in their accounts than most business owners. So when you look at all the immigrant savings bank records and you organize them by occupation, the people with the most money in their bank accounts were doctors and lawyers, as you might expect. The next highest group of savers was saloon keepers. Next were policemen. And then after that was peddlers. And peddlers saved more money than every other kind of business owner other than saloon keepers. So even though they looked kind of ragged, that was part of how you made money. You looked kind of pathetic and you hoped to get more customers by getting people who would take pity on you and buy something you were selling. Next slide, please. Some peddlers didn't carry their wares, but had, as you can see here, a horse-drawn carriage for their cart for their wares. And again, there was networking involved in peddling. So for example, I found that charcoal peddlers, and most of the famine immigrants would have burned charcoal, not coal, in their stoves in their tenement apartments. The charcoal peddlers came overwhelmingly from one parish in County Tyrone, which you can see here in the inset here. That's in what's now Northern Ireland today. From this one parish came almost all of the charcoal peddlers. Again, this was networking, where people who came, Irish immigrants who came before the famine, got into charcoal peddling, and then got the successive immigrants who came from this one parish known as Bodoni Lower, and set them up in charcoal work. And very often, the earlier charcoal peddlers became charcoal dealers and ran charcoal yards or became charcoal manufacturers, and they supplied the newer immigrants who became the street peddlers, like this fellow here in this image. Next slide, please. Next up the ladder were artisans. Here we've got an image with a print shop, a carpentry shop, and a paint shop. And those were very typical kinds of occupations that a famine immigrant might have. As I mentioned before, there are a disproportionately large number of artisans in the famine Irish population in New York. A lot. They make a much higher proportion of the Irish population in New York City than they did in Ireland. And that again tells you that it's not the poorest of the poor who are coming to America, even during the famine, but people who have done okay, have some skills that they know will make them desirable employees in America. What you also find with the artisans is they will typically start out like this fellow who's smack in the middle of the picture there. I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but right in the middle of the picture, that's the typical uniform of a journeyman artisan, with his apron there and his little cloth hat on top of his head to keep his hair clean, since he's a carpenter and lots of sawdust would be everywhere. Very often these journeymen who worked for wages for the owners of carpentry shops, print shops, painting shops, etc., they eventually would start their own carpentry shop or carpentry business and become employers. And that was a way that they could move up the socioeconomic ladder. Next slide, please. There were more tailors than any other kind of Irish artisan. Often how well you did if you started your own business, as George P. Fox did. He became one of New York City's best-known Irish clothing retailers. He started out as a journeyman, learned the ropes of retailing in New York, and then started his own business. The key to Fox's success was he was a shameless self-promoter. Most businesses, if they ran ads at all, ran little tiny ads in the newspaper asking customers to take notice. But Fox ran these huge column-long ads in which he bragged about the famous people that he made clothing for. And can we get the next slide, please? Most Irish tailors who worked in New York had learned to be tailors in America. It was hard for an Irish immigrant who came as an adult to learn a craft because they were too old to become apprentices. But there were some crafts that you could learn as an adult in New York. One of them was Morocco dressing. Morocco dressing was the craft of taking goat skins, and what you see on the left there is a fellow using a special tool to remove the hairs from the goat skin. And then the goat skins would be blown up into balloons and floated in this sumac solution, which you can see on the upper right, and tanned, and goat leather was used as a cheap alternative to calves leather in order to make things like cheap furniture and cheap book bindings. And so Morocco dressing was something that Irish immigrants learned in New York. And again, there was a networking factor involved. Immigrants from one parish in Donegal dominated the Morocco dressing trade in New York. Next slide, please. Moving to the upper half of the socioeconomic ladder, you can see here from the bank ledger that there are plenty of immigrants who arrive in America and immediately become clerks, like Thomas O'Farrell and John Holton and John Daly did in this image. You needed to have to be relatively well educated to become a clerk and have good handwriting in most cases. Civil service jobs didn't necessarily require good handwriting, of course. Next slide, please. Now, in the book, I talk about a whole slew of these lower status white collar workers, clerks, and civil servants. I talk about policemen in this chapter as well, even though it's not exactly a white collar job per se, but it paid very well. It also, like today, policemen could moonlight in various security roles and earn additional money, and that helps explain why the policemen saved so much money, as I mentioned before. So I talk about all sorts of ways in which famine immigrants rose to these jobs. I'll just mention briefly two here. One was Hubert Glynn, who had a year of college before he came to America. He got a job working for the New York State Commissioners of Immigration. Back in those days, each state regulated immigration to their locale. And so New York State had its own commissioners of immigration. Up until the mid-1850s, though, the commissioners took no records. When you immigrated to America, and this was the case during the entirety of the Great Famine, you took a ship to America, the ship landed at the docks. As the ship entered New York Harbor, a doctor would enter the ship and do a cursory look for people who had fevers. Those people would be sent to Staten Island to the hospital to recover at taxpayers' expense. And once you recovered, you were allowed to enter America. Everybody else, everyone who wasn't taken off the ship landed at a pier along the East River. It could be a pier anywhere up and down the East River. And no record of you was taken by anyone in New York. The ship, as you genealogists know, the ships had to keep a list of all the passengers. That was sent immediately to Washington. So the commissioners of immigration in 1855 decided they wanted to have a record of everybody who landed in New York also. And so they took Castle Garden, which was in what's now Battery Park, and had been a theater, and turned it in, but had been abandoned by this point, and turned it into an emigration depot. When they do that, they hired Hubert Glynn, who had worked for them for a couple of years as a clerk already, to be their chief clerk, in charge of the fellows like this guy on the bottom right, who took information about each immigrant who landed in America. Now, as those of you who've tried to trace ancestors who came to the US before Ellis Island opened will know, these records haven't survived. They were brought to Ellis Island when it opened in 1892. And then when the original Ellis Island buildings burned down a few years after it was built, those records were all destroyed. So those of us who wonder about who would like more detailed records than the ship manifest have, and these New York records had much more detail, including how much money every immigrant brought with them, unfortunately, those are lost. Next slide. Sometimes civil service clerkships were given out as a reward for honorable service to the country. That was the case with Colonel James Cavanaugh. He was part of the, as you can see here in this image, the 69th Regiment of New York State, which was known as the Fighting 69th. It was an all-Irish American regiment. During the Civil War, they saw bloody battle in the deadliest encounters of the war, from Bull Run, where they were the first ones to sustain casualties, all the way through the end of the war. Cavanaugh was one of their officers. He was wounded in battle at Fredericksburg, and after that left the army and went back to New York, where he went back to work as a carpenter, as a journeyman carpenter, which he had done before the war. He tried several times to open businesses, a carpentry business, that failed. He tried to become a builder. He failed at that. So there he was in old age, in his late 60s, still working as a journeyman carpenter, even though that was a really strenuous and hard thing to do at that age. And so his friends, seeing what had happened to him and knowing how much he had sacrificed for his country, went to their political friends and convinced them to give Cavanaugh a civil service position as a clerk on the Brooklyn docks, overseeing the dock workers there. And so Cavanaugh, for the last 10 years of his life, had a much better paying, more secure job as a civil servant to live out his golden years and his last 10 years of work. Can we get the next slide, please? Now, the highest rung on the socioeconomic ladder was doctor and lawyer, but only a tiny, tiny number of the famine immigrants would have had the educations necessary to reach that goal. And here I'm talking about people who emigrate as adults. Obviously, if you emigrate as a child, you go through the New York public schools or wherever you might move to, then you're gonna have the education necessary. But focusing here on the immigrants who come as adults, they wouldn't have been able to aspire to those jobs in most cases. Though I talk in the book about people, I talk about a painter who rises all the way to become a lawyer and a judge. And that's someone who came to America as an adult and was taught to read and write by his wife after he got married. So there are cases. But in most cases, being a business owner was the highest occupation you could aspire to if you were an adult famine immigrant. I have a whole chapter on business owners, so let me talk here about one of a couple of them. One of my favorite stories is the Morgan brothers. They come to New York as teenagers, and they begin working in very menial jobs. One of them is mucking out stables. The others are working as day laborers. One, however, the youngest one gets an apprenticeship as a printer and starts working as an apprentice printer at a newspaper. But they want to do better, and they are lodging with some other immigrants who work making soda for soda retailers. And they say, hey, that sounds like a lot better work than mucking out stables. And so they learn soda making from their compatriots, and eventually open their own soda business, which they call Morgan Brothers. And they make things like sarsaparilla, root beer, ginger beer, those kinds of things. They try for a while. One of the brothers tries for a while making cider as well. And they eventually have a very prosperous business, and they would take their wares around town in a cart like this, in little bottles like this, and go to restaurants and saloons and try to make sales. I actually was able to get a couple of years ago an actual Morgan Brothers soda bottle, which I'm holding right here. I'm not sure how well you can see it. It's clear glass, so it's a little hard to read the writing on it, but it says on it, Morgan Brothers, 145 West 35th Street, New York. And this, since we know what date they were there, this bottle is from we know from sometime between the late 1850s and the early 1870s when they eventually moved to a different address. And so the Morgan brothers are telling for a number of reasons. First, they show that to become a successful business owner, you could start out with nothing in New York like the Morgan brothers did. But furthermore, they tell the story of how ambitious the famine immigrants were. So these three brothers by the 1870s are, according to accounts not written by them, but by credit rating agencies, are already, quote, quite wealthy. And yet, what do they do in the 1870s when they're nearing about age 50? They decide, you know what? We can open another business. This soda business kind of runs itself. So if you get to the next slide, please. They started Morgan Brothers Storage and Moving. One of the brothers was left in charge of the soda business. The other two brothers started building up the moving business. And within 10 years, it was a thriving enterprise as well. So now they become doubly wealthy because they're now earning twice as much money. They have still their ownership of the soda business and the moving business besides. And both businesses actually still operate. The Morgan Brothers soda business eventually bought White Rock Soda, which was a Minnesota brand, and combined the two and started using the White Rock name. And White Rock is still a soda that you can buy in New York today. And Morgan Brothers Moving still exists. It's now known as Morgan Manhattan. If you Google it, you can get them to move you. So, or store your excess goods. So both businesses still operate today. Both started by these three very ambitious brothers. And of course, what did they do with their profits besides open another business? They invested it in Midtown Manhattan real estate, and that proved to be another source of great wealth for the Morgan families. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Nonetheless, the biggest moneymaker for being an Irish immigrant, other than a doctor and lawyer, was a saloon keeper. Not only did saloon keepers make more money than any other famine immigrants on average, but they also had great respect in the community. You can see the fellow there on the left behind the bar with the black coat and the black top hat. He's the barkeeper there. And not only is he the saloon keeper, the owner of the saloon, but he's also an alderman. He's a member of the board of aldermen of the city government. That's the precursor of today's city council. And so if you were arrested and you needed help getting out of jail, getting the charges reduced or dropped, if you're a famine immigrant, you're not likely to hire a lawyer. You're likely to go to send word to your local saloon keeper who would use his political clout to get you out of jail, or at least get bail set or get the charges reduced. If you were sick and couldn't afford a doctor, your local saloon keeper would send one at no expense, knowing that you would then repay the favor one day, perhaps with going out and posting bills when it came to be election time, or being one of the people who would rouse the voters from the tenement and come out to vote. Next slide, please. So I'll just end by talking briefly about two saloon keepers whose stories I tell in the book that I think are quite interesting. Bernard Woods opens a saloon in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, right near the East River. What he does with his profits, like most saloon keepers, he buys real estate. What he becomes famous for, though, is he buys down the block. There is a building that he turns into an athletic arena. The press calls it a miniature Madison Square Garden. And Woods Athletic Grounds, as it was known, had sporting events, boxing matches, marathon walk races, union meetings, Irish liberation meetings, and so forth. And so Bernard Woods becomes famous for that. It was also very typical that saloon keepers' sons would climb the socioeconomic ladder to that highest rung. So Woods had two sons. One became a lawyer, the other became a priest. And it was quite common. In fact, it was typical that New York City priests of the generation after the famine immigrants were more often than not the sons of saloon keepers, because priests had to go to college, and saloon keepers' sons were some of the few famine immigrants who could afford college. Then on the right, we have Thomas Fenton. I love his story. He comes to New York. He works for his first 10 years in New York as a gardener, saves his money. He's very frugal, super frugal. And of course, many of these famine immigrants are obsessively frugal, right? They came from Ireland, where they had ended up not having enough money to feed their families, watching their parents, their spouses, their children starve before their eyes. That scarred them, and they were determined never to run out of money again. Thomas Fenton took this to an extreme extent. After 10 years as a gardener, he saved enough money to open a saloon far uptown in the area just south of Washington Heights, right now in Manhattan. And he opens a saloon there, and he lives very frugally. When he dies around 1890, and the probate people come to assess his possessions, they're worth less than $50. But his heirs, who think the miser has some money socked away somewhere, say, well, wait, in addition to that little bit of possessions, there's that little tiny safe he has there. We should open that. And so the surrogate court orders the little safe to be open. And inside they find passbooks from 30 different banks in which he had accounts. They also find bonds, and they also find deeds for dozens of properties in Upper Manhattan. So it turned out Fenton was a rich, rich man, but he never bought himself anything, and lived very frugally for the rest of his life. And his fortune was then fought over for more than a decade by the wife he married just before he died. He had become a widower soon before his death. He married a wife just before he died, and his kids, and they fought over his fortune for many years thereafter. And you find, this is one of the ways I find great stories about the famine immigrants, is so often there are fights about the wills and the estates of the famine immigrants. And that's one way you can see both how well they're doing and how litigious the famine immigrants become. Next slide, please. So our final slide just points out the extent to which the famine immigrants rose up the socioeconomic ladder. So what you can see there is, in the middle is where they started, which I showed you before, and on the right is where the famine immigrants who could be tracked 20 or more years ended up. Now, we should note there are lots of famine immigrants who can't be tracked 20 years because they die soon after they arrive in New York. People are dying all the time. Saloon keepers are dying in their 30s and 40s. And I talk in great detail about how omnipresent death is in the lives of the famine immigrants. But for those who have the health to climb the socioeconomic ladder, what you see is by the end of their lives, only 25% of the famine immigrants are still doing unskilled work. So only 25% end their lives there. So far different than historians have imagined previously. And in fact, if you add up the numbers on the top half of the ladder there, you can see that 45% of the famine immigrants have moved into white-collar work, in particular business ownership. In fact, famine immigrants were more likely than native-born New Yorkers of the same age to own businesses. And that's the case still to this day. Immigrants feeling discriminated against, or that they have glass ceilings in other occupations, are much more likely to open businesses than native-born Americans. So anyway, if we can go to the last slide. That's, in a nutshell, the story of Plentiful Country. I've got other chapters in there also that we haven't talked about. In particular, a chapter about the immigrants who leave New York, right? So New York would have had millions and millions of, or at least a million famine immigrants had the immigrants not spread out all over the country. So a lot of famine immigrants will spend some years in New York, like Peter Lynch, and then move elsewhere. And so I have a chapter about that. But that's the story of Plentiful Country. And so now we'll talk more.
Okay, and thank you so much, Professor Anbinder, for that wonderful overview of your book. It is so well researched, and I think a lot of our readers will really enjoy digging more into it. What drew you to this particular topic of why you wanted to talk about the famine immigrants and really dispel the myth that they did not have the opportunities and did not rise?
Well, what's interesting in about my answer is I had no intention of writing a book about the famine immigrants. And when I started, I had no intention of dispelling a myth because I didn't think there was a myth to dispel. I assumed that the typical telling of the famine immigrant story was true, and I would simply be using the immigrant bank records to document that. So what drew me to it was this great resource, this immigrant savings bank records that I discovered at the very last minute while finishing my book, 5 Points, which came out in 2001. That's a book about the most famous Irish immigrant neighborhood in 19th century New York. And at the very end of work on that book, 5 Points was known as a slum back then. And I depict the book mostly as a slum as I was writing it. But then just as I'm finishing writing the book, these records became available. So I went to the New York Public Library where the records are held, although now they're digitized and on ancestry.com. I went expecting to find that the 5 Pointers had tiny amounts of money in their bank accounts, if they had bank accounts at all, and I would use that to document how terrible their lives were. But what I found was just the opposite. The 5 Pointers had lots and lots of money in their accounts. And not only that, that huge numbers of 5 Points residents had accounts. You know, you could look at some tenements and find half the residents of a single tenement, like that 31 Baxter Street, for instance, that we looked at the beginning of the talk. Half of them had accounts at the immigrant savings bank. So it's not just like the 1 in 10 who's doing well. And so it was the fact that I found this, I said, but I thought the 5 Pointers maybe were anomalous. And my goal really was just to tell the stories of the famine immigrants in more detail than before. And it was only while I was, several years into the project that I started gathering enough data to really see that the immigrants are doing much better than people had previously thought.
Absolutely, and I definitely think it is a myth that you said that a lot of people that were maybe in some of the poorer neighborhoods didn't do so well. Maybe you could speak a little bit more specifically about women's opportunities, since I know you didn't get a chance to get into the presentation, but largely we like to think of women were just mostly just domestics, but you found more than that as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and what I thought was especially interesting was that the largest number of employed women after domestics of Irish women were actually business owners. Now, typically, women were running businesses with their husbands, but in other cases, women were running businesses on their own. And again, this goes back to the frugality and the obsessive desire to save among the famine immigrants. So sometimes the husband will work as a day laborer and the wife will run a boarding house or will run a fruit stand. And often the boarding house would do better than the husband was doing at day labor. So the husband would quit day labor to help run the boarding house. I tell a great story about that with this one story of this Johanna Boyle, who is a hat maker. And she starts a hat business on 9th Avenue. And it's so successful that her husband quits his job to help run the business. He goes out around town and buys the materials for her to make the hats to sell in the store. And she had great taste. She's a savvy businesswoman. She becomes so good at this that she ends up with lots of employees making the hats so she can focus on selling in the shop. And they make huge amounts of money doing this. So there's lots of opportunities for women. Though the case of Johanna Boyle is instructive because when her husband dies, in his will, he orders that their savings go mostly to people other than his wife. And she sued in court and said this isn't fair. And the court ruled, said, sorry, under the law that was on the books when you opened your hat shop in the early 1850s. Everything a woman owned was legally the property of her husband, and the husband in his will could give it away to other people. Only in 1860 did New York State pass a law that changed that, but since her business had been started earlier, it didn't apply.
Absolutely. And there was so much research done into the different occupations. How did you and your team learn so much about all the ins and outs of all these different occupations and details that you discussed in the book?
Well, in part, I've been writing about mid 19th century New York and America for 30 years. So, and focusing on immigrants, you learn a lot about the jobs that immigrants do. Plus, with newspaper digitization now, it's you can look up things like, you can search for Morocco dressing and you can find, newspaper stories. And then on Google Books, I found whole books about leather dressing that had chapters on Morocco dressing. And so you can learn the details that way. So between the press and other original sources, you can learn a great deal. And of course, there are labor historians who preceded me who've written about some of these trades as well.
A question we got from several different people asked about, could your findings from the New York Immigrant Savings Bank translate to some other cities like Boston, Chicago, and some other areas where a lot of Irish immigrants came to? And do you think that there would be similar results of saving the same amount of money and the same opportunities of going up the economic ladder?
I definitely think the results would be similar. There are occasional exceptions. If you happen to be unlucky enough to settle in an economic backwater, that wouldn't be so good. But if you did that, you would most likely leave, and an immigrant would be even more likely to leave than someone who was native born and had generations of family there. So with that exception, I would say yes, you would find that to be the case. And in particular, what I found was, and I talk about this in the chapter I didn't discuss in my talk, immigrants who moved out of New York did even better than immigrants who stayed in New York. And that's primarily because they could much more easily afford to buy real estate if they left New York City. And real estate was really the key to building generational wealth for the famine immigrants, because you might become an alcoholic and drink away your savings. You might get sick and spend all your money trying to get well with doctors and cures. And I talk in the book about several of both such cases. But once you put money in real estate, it was really hard to lose it, and it was much easier to pass to your family. And I talk, for instance, about these two immigrants who both moved from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn Heights. They buy townhouses next door to each other in Brooklyn Heights, and had their families kept their townhouses, they're worth several thousand times more today than they were when they were bought. So had they kept those, they'd be very wealthy people indeed. And so real estate was the key. And people who left the New York City metropolitan area, the famine immigrants, about half bought real estate before they died. Whereas if you stayed in New York City, only about 10% of the famine immigrants were eventually able to afford real estate. And those were mostly saloon keepers.
Great. And I will give a small plug for a couple of databases on our website, American Ancestors. We actually have the Provident Institution for Savings for Boston, and also records for the Old Stone Bank for Providence, Rhode Island. So definitely there are more areas for immigrant savings research, since a lot of people are very interested. A couple of follow-up questions we got from some people in the audience. One person asked, going back to what you said about a lot of the Irish leaving New York City, what percentage did you find roughly that of people that stayed in New York City versus leaving to another part, based on that study that you and your team did?
So of the people who survived, about half seemed to stay in New York City and about half left. And when I talk about leaving, though, it could be going as short a distance as Hoboken or Jersey City.
Mhm.
So about half stay and about half leave. And that's roughly what I found.
Did you find that women had separate accounts from their husbands at the Immigrant Savings Bank? I know that there was one example where they found their husband was a bit of a drinker, and I think they was told not to give him any money. But did you find that there were a lot of women maybe having separate accounts, especially if they were business owners?
So there are lots of Irish women who have accounts that are in their name only and not their husband's name. But we know from looking at the accounts of non-Irish account holders at the Emigrant Bank and also at other banks like some of the ones you've mentioned. I've looked in particular at the biggest bank in Philadelphia, whose records are also still available from this period. The married Irish women were less likely to have accounts in their names only than non-Irish married women. So there are plenty of women with accounts in their own name, but not as many as in other groups, which makes one think that it was to some extent culturally frowned upon for women to act financially independent. And in fact, you see one of the things with Joanna Boyle, she has accounts in her own name, but her husband wills the money in those accounts to his brother and his sister when he dies, even though the account is in her name. So the account in your name gave you a little bit of independence, but if your husband went to court, not very much.
And you did a really nice chapter on talking about the history of the famine and how it really impacted different parts of Ireland, especially Southwest Ireland. And you look in places like Cork and Kerry. Were you noticing a lot of different patterns amongst the economic levels of those that were coming from different counties in Ireland, and at different times when they might have traveled, whether right during the famine or afterward, based on those arrival dates?
So what I found was that in that sense that you're asking about, the famine immigrants match the kind of economics of Ireland as a whole. So the immigrants who come from Northern and Eastern Ireland are more likely to have better jobs when they first get to America and have a bit more money in their accounts when they open them. And the immigrants from Southern and Western Ireland tended to be more likely to start as day laborers and to have less money in their accounts. We're not talking a huge amount of money, and we're not talking about a huge difference in the occupations they had when they first got to America, but there is a significant difference, and that tends to be what you found.
Okay, interesting. We had another question in the chat we got. They wanted to know if did some of the famine immigrants or their descendants, did they lose their drive to succeed as decades had passed and we started going more into the early to mid 20th century? Do you find that they were less likely to be as maybe ambitious to become business owners based on the study that you've done on the ones tracked through the immigrant savings banks?
Right. So I have a chapter also on the children of the famine immigrants, where I talk about this in some detail. And the answer is no. The children of the famine immigrants moved significantly higher up the socioeconomic ladder than their parents had managed to climb. And that's kind of steady no matter whether the immigrants stayed in New York or they moved elsewhere. And so the children of the famine immigrants are much more likely to have white-collar jobs than their parents. Now, and so no, you do not see, well, ambition. That's a tough one. So I did not study the children of the immigrants enough to know, were there people like Fenton or the Morgan brothers who were, working, who were obsessively saving. That you probably weren't going to see as much. And you don't see. And so I talk, for instance, in the book, there's some notable examples of this. I talk about the richest famine immigrants who moved to the famine immigrant who became the richest of the people I talk about in my book was this guy who arrives in New York trained as a blind maker, making window blinds. And he ends up marrying a 15-year-old girl whose father was an Irish American, an immigrant, but had come as a child, who was a billiards champion. And the guy's father-in-law would always complain about how bad the billiard tables were that he had to play on. And so the blind maker thought, pool tables. I should make pool tables. I can take your expertise, your knowledge, and your fame, and we can market pool tables. And so they start making billiard tables, and they make a fortune. um, and they end up being the richest immigrants. His son dies after a kind of profligate life where the only thing he was famous for was heavy drinking and buying fast horses and fast boats. That was his claim to fame. So yeah, there's definitely for the family immigrants who do really well, that's the case. John Lane is another great example. The guy I talked about at the beginning. His two sons are complete ne'er-do-wells who um, were severe alcoholics and never have steady jobs and literally wait at their father's apartment for him to die so they can inherit his tenement and split the money. And so, yeah, there is definitely some lack of ambition. But when you look overall, the kids of the family immigrants move higher.
Okay. And when you compare with other books that you've done, like City of Dreams and also 5 Points, did you find that there was a different level of economic success between native Irish or maybe descendants of other immigrant groups, maybe like English, uh, Jewish, Italian? Were you able to notice any other similarities or differences when comparing the data for the Irish?
Well, so initially, the Irish do not do as well as other immigrant groups of their era because they come with less. And so the famine Irish start lower on the socioeconomic ladder of the United States than, say, German immigrants do, or Scottish immigrants do, or English immigrants do. Um, and it takes about a generation and when you look at the children of those immigrants, the children of the Irish are doing almost as well as the children of those other immigrants and native born Americans. And then once you get two generations on, the grandchildren of the famine immigrants are indistinguishable from native born Americans and indistinguishable from the grandchildren of other immigrants. So yeah, the Irish start out behind, but their children mostly catch up and their grandchildren completely catch up.
Okay, great. How do you feel that the depiction in like movies like Gangs in New York represents 5 Points neighborhood after you've done so much research about neighborhoods like that and how they might have represented Irish Americans?
I smile because I get asked that all the time. Um, so here's what I would say about that film, Gangs of New York. So I was a historical advisor to the film. So
Oh, wow, interesting.
yeah, and so I was asked to read the screenplay, and I met with Scorsese, and he asked me to go page by page through the screenplay and point out all the historical inaccuracies. And I did that with him over the course of 3 hours and pointed out every single inaccuracy. And I would, point to one and I'd say, you have this happening here, but that couldn't have happened. And he'd say, yeah, I know, but I need some artistic license. And so I'm doing that. And then I point to the next one. He'd say, yeah, I know that's not true, but that scene is an homage to a scene in the 1926 film Battleship Potemkin. And so that's why it has to be that way because it's mimicking the scene in that film. And then I said, all right, the next one, here's another one. And I said, that one definitely would have had nothing like that. And he said, yeah, I know that's not true, but that scene appeared to me in a dream, and my dreams are really important to me. And I feel like I have to honor my dreams by giving them a place in my films. And we went on and on like that for 3 hours. There was one thing in the entire 3 hours he said it would change based on what I mentioned. And he turns to his minion sitting behind him. He says, change that. And so I went to see the movie when it came out 2 years later. And had he changed the scene? No, he hadn't. So what I tell people is the movie looks exactly right. So the look of 5 Points, that is exactly what 5 Points looked like. They took old pictures and they built it to look exactly the same. The clothing is exactly the same. Leonardo DiCaprio's accent is terrible, so we have to say that. Uh, so that would not have been right. But the content of the story, the theme, which is that the Irish had to literally fight for their place in America and acceptance in America, absolutely true. All the details he uses to convey that theme, not so true.
Looks like we have one more last question, and the question is, how do you feel that since you've researched your family and found that you have famine immigrants that came to New York. How does that change how you view your own family history, knowing that you did have a family that did struggle but did make it as well?
Well, it's interesting because when I started writing the book, I did not know that I had any famine immigrants in my family tree. I had one Irish aunt, but my impression was that most of her ancestors had come post-famine. But as I got towards the end of the book, I thought, I really ought to check this more thoroughly now that, with things like ancestry.com, you have access to so much more material. And so, of course, it turned out, as everybody seems to have, that she had one relative. She said, the genealogy nut in my family is this guy. Go contact him. Maybe he's found something. So I contacted him, and sure enough, I discovered the Killeen family that had moved to New York and then to Buffalo in the 1850s. And John Killeen, who was the famine immigrant husband of this family, had come from County Clare, and he worked for almost 40 years for the New York Central Railroad in and around Buffalo. And he married a woman from the same townland in Ireland, in County Clare, that he had come from. So I was surprised but pleased to be able to put a piece of my own family tree into the book. I did that in City of Dreams with my Eastern European Jewish ancestors and so forth. So I was glad to be able to surprisingly add that to this book as well.
Thank you, Tyler. Your insights have been really invaluable, and I think it's really shown people how, studying the social and economic history of our ancestors can be done, and we shouldn't, think that just because someone may be a day laborer or something else, there's not more to their story. Your book definitely brings to light all of these mini stories found through the records, and it's just a matter of pulling them out. So I thank you for, honoring the legacy of these famine immigrants, and I'm going to now call in Margaret to go to her next section. Thank
Melanie,
you.
thank you so much. And thank you, Tyler. We are grateful
Thank
for
you.
the information that both of you have shared and for the research tips, and most of all for your deep knowledge, both of you. How lucky we are to be able to hear from you tonight. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we have asked Tyler to do a final reading from his book. So back to you for that, Professor.
Sure. So this is a part of the book where I'm talking about the descendants of the famine immigrants, and I talk about an Irish fair that was held in New York on the 50th anniversary of Black 47 as a fundraiser to try to build a monument to the famine and the Irish in America. And so that's the context you need to understand these two paragraphs. The experience of the famine Irish in America, like that of Kate Murphy at the Irish Fair, was bittersweet. There was sadness about the circumstances of their emigration and all that had been involuntarily left behind. And there were lofty dreams, like the building of an Irish palace, that never came to fruition. Yet there was also the pride in all that had been accomplished, the obstacles overcome, the nest eggs put away, the businesses launched, the offspring set on the path to middle class respectability, or in a few cases, great fortunes. More than a century later, in the East Room of the White House on St. Patrick's Day, with the Prime Minister of Ireland looking on, an American president whose great-great-great-grandfather had immigrated to the United States during the famine invoked the story of Kate Murphy, noting that her heart and those of many Irish immigrants had clearly been torn between their love of America and their longing for the land they had left behind. Like so many other Americans with Irish roots, Barack Obama had learned that there was more to the story of the famine immigrants than the familiar tale of overcoming hardship through strength and sacrifice and faith and family. As Obama noted, quote, "The Irish did more than help build America. They helped sharpen the idea of America, the notion that no matter who you are, where you come from, what your last name is, in this country, you can make it." In that manner, the 44th president recognized the famine immigrants had changed how Americans define their nation and its ideals. 175 years after the Great Famine and the unprecedented influx of Irish immigrants into the United States that it precipitated, Americans still, as Obama put it, revel in that idea, the grand promise of the American dream and the notion that anyone can achieve it. In this sense, and in all Americans, the famine generation lives on.
Thank you so much, Tyler, for reminding us of the great promise of America then and now, and also of so many of our immigrant histories. We come from all sorts of places, and we are really made strong. I like that word sharpened by our ancestors who crossed many seas. So thank you so much for this history, and also for your great reading. It's food for thought. A reminder to our audience out there, those who bought event tickets with books included, your signed copies of Plentiful Country will be sent from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. in the weeks ahead. Those of you who registered for the virtual event, only if you would like now to buy a signed book, you can order directly from Porter Square through mid-morning tomorrow, as they have copies that are left over. The same goes for bundled book buyers. If you want additional copies as gifts sent anywhere in the U.S., order them directly from Porter Square Books. We've closed out our accounts here at American Ancestors. And now moving toward wrapping up, we at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to present tonight's book talk. If you're researching a time, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help. Experts such as Melanie. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists and our Brew Family Learning Center, which both Melanie and I work with and for, and Kelly behind the scenes. We host many educational programs providing insight on accessing all sorts of records that make up America's history. In our follow-up email tonight, coming to you from Kelly, we'll send more information on how to access American Ancestors expert staff and our programs. So many of them are for free. Our mission in all we do is to educate, to inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, please join us for more author talks. Looking ahead, on June 11, in partnership with Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network, we're going to welcome Charleston, South Carolina authors Joseph McGill and Herb Fraser with their book, Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery, which is a free event. These two will be joined by moderator Cynthia Evans, research director at American Ancestors' 10 Million Names Project. Author Joseph McGill has worked at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. He's been a former park ranger and a Civil War reenactor, but most significantly for this book, he's the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project and has spent many nights in former slave dwellings throughout our country. Our three guests will discuss Joe's experience and the history of these sites. On June 24, with GBH again, we're focused on the West Coast, looking at the history of San Francisco and its 1906 earthquake and fire, as described by author Matthew J. Davenport in his book, The Longest Minute. And then right after the July 4th holiday, we'll gain insight from Jeffrey Rosen, president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, about the Declaration of Independence, specifically the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. His new book looks at what inspired our founders and by what measures they defined happiness and then democracy. Again, there is so much to learn here, but back to tonight, I want to thank our special guests this evening, Tyler Anbinder and Melanie McComb. What great insight you shared with us about Irish America and the remarkable communities, families, and individuals that helped make this country. We've learned a tremendous amount. And to the audience out there in Zoom land, we thank you. We appreciate your interest in America's history, all its people and places. We hope to see you again. But for now, again, thanks to all from all of us behind the scenes, and have a good night. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Tyler. Thank you. Bye, everybody.